The question I asked on LinkedIn read, do Agile approaches help ERP implementations and digital transformation projects go more smoothly? Or is it just another buzzword approach that fails to fix the root cause of failure? I'm curious to hear what you all think. So this is a post I made a few days ago, and I got a lot of responses. And I won't go through them all, but I wanted to cherry pick some of the diverse opinions and different points of view that have come up in this discussion here on social media. And I'd actually be curious to hear what some of the listeners think that weren't part of this discussion. I'd love to hear your feedback on this as well. So really the root of the question is Agile versus Waterfall. Is Agile appropriate for ERP? And maybe just to back up, I'll talk about what Agile is. Agile transformations typically involve more of a bite-sized, quick-hit, incremental type of approach to transformation, whereas Waterfall is more of your traditional sequential type of approach. So with Waterfall, which is the historically traditional way that you would implement any sort of software or technology, you would have a designated design phase where you define all your requirements and your business processes, and then you get through that entire phase before you start building and testing and deploying technology. Now, Agile, on the other hand, takes a different approach. It doesn't have such a long lead time in that upfront design phase, and it's focused on pulling out bits and pieces or smaller parts of the organization to get quick wins and to get functionality up and running more quickly. So the whole idea behind Agile and the whole appeal of Agile is that it could be a way to get value faster. It can be a way to get some quick wins, get momentum, and not have to spend a ton of time and money up front before you even start deploying or even designing some of the technology. So that's the gist of what we're talking about here today. And I have strong opinions on this topic, but I always love to hear what others think. So the question is Agile versus Waterfall. Is Agile actually better than Waterfall? Agile is a hot thing right now, big buzzword. A lot of people are focused on Agile, and it's sort of the new flavor of the month, I guess I'd say, from a project management and a development perspective. So some of the feedback we received to that question, first of all, in no particular order, Malcolm Sask, who's someone that I interact with on LinkedIn, came back with a comment here that said, shouldn't that be a decision based on the client situation, not the implementer? And that's a great point that I couldn't agree more with. A lot of times, I think we tend, as consultants, we tend to have preconceived ideas or cookie cutter answers that we think is a one-size-fits-all approach. And the reality is that no approach, whether it's Agile or Waterfall or any other sort of methodology or tool set, is going to be 100% perfect or 100% appropriate for all organizations out there. You really have to look at, what the specific situation of the team is and of the organization and the culture that you're dealing with. So that's another sort of a first point here, is that it really should be based on the client situation, not the implementer. I will say that most implementers, or a lot of system integrators and implementers now, are moving more towards an Agile development and implementation approach. Whether that's right or wrong is a different story, but that tends to be where a lot of system integrators are moving. And part of that is because I think, in my opinion, there's been so many failures in the past, and so much of the failures in the past have been a result of not ever really getting any value from the investments, that Agile in some ways is somewhat of a course correction, and in some ways an overcorrection to what has been a challenge with transformations and ERP implementations in the past. So with that, I think the pendulum swinging to the other extreme now, where a lot of system implementers are focusing on that Agile sort of approach and really trying to get more of a quick hit, low-hanging fruit type of approach to these sorts of transformations. So that's one point there. Another point that we received here from Dennis Anthony. He said, at the end of the day, if the client does not know to prepare the business case stating clearly his or her current infrastructure and to the level he wants, the move to failure is inevitable. So I think the point Dennis is trying to make there is that you need to have a business case, and you need to have the right infrastructure to make your project successful. Another really interesting point that I received in this question is from Carl Walter Kiersted, and I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Carl. But he's someone that I know I recognize his name. We've been connected for quite a few years, if I remember correctly. But his comment is pretty telling and pretty interesting. He said, it's hard to comment is there seem to be at least two popular definitions. One, there's the tactical component of Agile, so that's just how we execute. And then number two is the strategic component of Agile, so looking at the strategic changes in the outside world and adjusting to those situations. And his point here is that he doesn't think that just that tactical approach to Agile on its own is going to be successful, but really you need a blend of both. You need the execution and the strategic aspect of Agile. And I'm not sure if this is exactly what Carl was insinuating or where he was going with that thread or that thought process, but just to add to what he's saying here, I think that a big problem with Agile is that too many organizations use it as an excuse to not clearly define all of their business requirements and their end-to-end processes and really define what that big picture is. If you don't have that big picture view, I guess the good news is you didn't have to spend the time up front defining the big picture, and you get into the actual execution and implementation faster, which may feel like you're moving along faster. But what we see oftentimes in the long run is that you end up going in a bunch of different directions. There's no clear vision for where the project is headed, what you're trying to accomplish. Back to the previous point about the business case, if you don't have a clear business case of what kind of value you're trying to get, you're just going to go off and start building stuff that may or may not be aligned with your longer term, bigger picture, strategic aspects of your organization. So it's really important to make sure that you have that big picture view. And you can certainly go execute and implement from an Agile perspective, but there is a lot of value in defining those end-to-end processes, especially for organizations that have grown through acquisition or they have disparate operations or independent ways of operating, and they're trying to pull this all together. If that's the case, then you don't want to just jump into an Agile situation because you're going to end up back where you are, which is you implement a bunch of stuff quickly, but it's going to be stuff that's going to most likely be aligned with the way you do things today, not necessarily where you want to be going strategically. So I think the key here is to really find that balance, and I think that's what Carl is referring to as well in some of his comments here. Some other comments we have here, from Darrow Weiss. He said, after hundreds of implementations, his company found it overwhelming evidence that Agile is far superior to Waterfall if done correctly. Too often customers mistake Agile sprints with races, cutting corners and not thoroughly testing and assuring readiness before a go live. And that's really well put. Agile can work if you do it correctly, but too many people, I think, in my opinion, abuse the whole Agile concept. And again, I hate to call out the industry, but I feel like there's a lot of this is used as an excuse to cut corners or to take the easy route, which is let's just go build stuff. Let's not worry about getting internal alignment. Let's not worry about defining end-to-end business processes. And a lot of that legwork, that heavy lifting that should happen up front, Agile is oftentimes used as an excuse to bypass some of those things. So that's something that you really want to watch for if you are moving into an Agile sort of development environment or a transformation environment, whether it's your own PMO or your own organization that's driving it, or whether it's your system integrator. You want to make sure you have a clear vision and that you can use these Agile sprints as a way to get to a clear, bigger picture, long-term view of how this transformation fits into your organization. Some other comments here. One is from Pardeep Kalsi. He said, requirements, solution development, and design completion can be Agile. When you get to user acceptance and deployment, a traditional waterfall approach is needed. The business change needs time to be determined and change management initiatives to be put in place. And that's a really good point too. I think there's something to be said about the focus on change management and making sure that you have those change initiatives in place and the change support to ensure that the people are moving along with the transformation. One thing about Agile is the Agile approach is really focused on getting processes and systems in place quickly, in which you can do that. In theory, you can do that pretty quickly. You can generally do that a lot faster than you can move people. And Agile, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily help with the people side of the equation. If people are the ones holding back the speed at which a project moves, then you need something that's in sync with that people side of the equation. Not to say necessarily that you should be going slower, but you at the very least need to invest very heavily in change management to ensure your people can change as quickly as you can develop new software and roll out new processes and changes along the way. Or if you can't do that, or if you have a kind of culture that's just very slow to change and it's going to be resistant to change, you may find that Agile actually is moving too fast, and you actually might find some value in slowing down and having a more deliberate, steady, measured approach to how you deploy technology. Another comment here from Andrew Mills. He says, being systemic and having a clearly defined approach is more important. I would say going live with an entire warehouse can't be Agile, but the development and testing that lead to it, yes. I think having phases like SIT, UAT, so testing, system integration testing, or user acceptance testing, are important for large phased changes. I think that's a very good point and very well put. Having a clearly defined approach is more important. And a lot of times, set aside Agile and Waterfall for a second and just talk about general strategy and general implementation approach and priorities. If all you do is have alignment on what those priorities are and what the appropriate approach is, that alone is a lot more powerful than arguing over whether or not Agile is right or wrong, or whether Waterfall is right or wrong, or whether you should do a big bang or phased approach. There's a lot of different decisions that need to be made. Some of them may be better decisions for your organization. Some of them may be less good for your organization. But what's even more important than the decisions themselves is just making sure that your entire team is on the same page and headed in the same direction. If you have that level of alignment, to me, that's more important than the actual decision itself. Now, ideally, you would have both. You would have the right decision that makes the most sense for you as an organization, but you would also have the other aspect of it as well. So some other thoughts here, some other questions, or responses, I should say. Agile alone cannot fix the root causes of failure. Agile can work depending on the ERP being deployed and the readiness of the organization. It's a great point. I think you have to look at your culture and see, if you're a startup, if you're an entrepreneurial company, if you're a smaller company, if you're a company that moves very quickly and you adapt very quickly, then Agile probably makes a little bit more sense than other counterparts that you might see. Now, if you're a big multinational organization and you've acquired a bunch of companies, you've entered new markets, you're slow to change, you have pockets of resistance within the organization, which most organizations do. If all those things add up to a different scenario where maybe a more waterfall-centric approach makes sense, then you should do that. I think at the end of the day, there is no right or wrong answer universally. It's just a matter of fitting the right approach with the right situation. And so that's a great point that Andrew has there. Peter Bjorkman, which is another industry peer that I've been connected with for a long time, he always has good comments, and this is no different here. This is a very good comment. If by Agile you mean just get started, then it's a bad idea. As a smart man said, if I were given 1 hour to save the planet, I would spend 59 minutes defining the problem and 1 minute resolving it. And that was Albert Einstein that said that. So great, relevant quote. I couldn't agree more. And that quote is actually very relevant. And I think the problem that Peter is pointing out is that too many teams use it as an excuse to let's just get started. Let's just do something. And sometimes that's not the right answer. You don't need to do something. You need to do the right thing. You need to be deliberate and focused and have a clear strategy that makes the most sense for you as an organization. One thing I'll add to what Peter said too is that a lot of times system integrators, in my opinion, will use Agile as an excuse to let's just get started. Hire us now and we will come tomorrow and we will start doing stuff. And it's a way to get a foot in the door. It's a way to start showing some immediate value, which everyone wants to do. They want to see value. They want to see results. But the problem is if you don't have a clear vision, a clear direction, you're just going to be paying for that speed later on. And you're going to end up spending a lot of time and money doing things that aren't relevant to your business or that you could be doing more effectively. So I think that's well put. Spend most of your time planning, and then the other stuff will fall into place. I guess I'll take one other point here just in the interest of time. There was a ton of responses, I should say. Actually I'll give you two because one is very simple. Barry Clark responded, the question was, is Agile, the right answer? Barry Clark said no. And that was his response. So didn't elaborate on that, but had a strong reaction to that. And then the final comment I'll point out here, the response that we saw here in this post on LinkedIn is I don't believe Agile Approach is suited for ERP projects. It is extremely critical to finish a stage and then move on to the next. Clean gateways are one of the only ways to assure ensure project success. The Agile approach will be counterproductive. So, strong reaction, sort of a counterpoint to some of the other pro-Agile sorts of sentiments that you oftentimes see in the market. I would just say, I agree with you in many cases, but I do think there are cases where Agile can work. Like I said, if you're a startup, you're a smaller company, you're high growth, or you're a type of company that just moves fast, then Agile can work well if you have the right boundaries and the right guardrails in place. And the boundaries and the guardrails are typically going to be that clear strategic vision of where you're headed so that you can take these Agile sprints and be going in the right direction and not heading off on the wrong track. So I appreciate everyone's feedback on that question too. It's something I love getting feedback and just hearing the rationale and seeing what the diverse viewpoints are. Again, if we're not connected on LinkedIn, I highly encourage you, please reach out. Let's connect and be part of this conversation. And if you have suggestions on questions that I pose to the group or the questions or topics you'd like to see me cover on this podcast, I'd love to hear your feedback. So this question we posed on social media is related to who should own a digital transformation, who within the organization should be responsible for it, who should set the strategy and the direction, who's ultimately accountable and responsible for making sure it's successful. And oftentimes it's assumed that it's IT. Oftentimes it's assumed that it's someone in operations, and there's a lot of different people that can own a project. And so really what framed this question was a study that I included a graphic for in this post. And it was a study that asked organizations who was leading their digital transformation. And the study was commissioned by APQC. If you go to apqc.org, you can see a lot of their research out there. But they're a nonprofit industry and technology agnostic firm, a lot like Third Stage, although they're more of an analyst firm. We're obviously transformation consulting, but they do a lot of good research that is interesting. And this particular study asked the question of, who owns the transformation within your organization. And 20%, which was the biggest response, 20% said IT owned it. 18% said their corporate strategy group owned it. 17.5% said they had a transformation office that owned it. And then 12% said that they had some sort of executive suite that owned it. And then the least common response here was 8% said that it was a standalone program or center of excellence. So not to say that any of these are right or wrong, or those are the way you should be thinking about it. It's pretty evenly distributed, so it doesn't really give you a good sense of what the quote-unquote right answer is. So I pose the question of, most digital transformation and ERP initiatives are still led by the IT function. Should they be led by other internal groups instead? That was the way I framed it, and then I included a link or a graphic that showed these survey results. And we got some really good responses here. Eric Martins, who's someone I've been connected to for a long time, he responded with, the only required process is the process of ongoing structured conversations where the relationship is the container which holds this together. Within every organizational and operational environment, within every transaction, an individual should be able to open an automated line with the owner of the space. This conversational process can be automated and triggered within a structured and automated environment where users can come up with their thoughts, ideas, feelings, actions, etc. So I think what he's saying is more of a collaborative sort of approach with different stakeholders that are involved in making sure that they're collaborating and creating a shared purpose for what the transformation is. Another response here is from Mark DiGiorgio, I believe is how you pronounce it. And I may be butchering that, and I apologize if I am, Mark. But he responded with, unless you have a unicorn IT leader, in my opinion, they should be led by the business. But IT needs to be a key stakeholder in the decision process and implementation process. Otherwise, without their voice heard, good luck trying to get support when it comes to rollout, data migration, integration, etc. And that's a great response. That's probably the one that's most aligned with the way I think about it as far as what IT's role should be and who all should own this sort of project. Generally, we find that organizations that have IT running the project typically aren't going to be as successful as the ones that have business running the project. You really need that business ownership and that clear vision of what this means from a business perspective, and also because you need the business to own it just to be successful from a resourcing and a business process and a organizational impact, organizational ownership perspective. You need the different parts of the business to to own the project. But at the same time, you need IT to support. You can't really do this without IT. IT should absolutely be involved. But I think the key here is you don't want to just pass it off to the CIO or to the IT director and he or his or her project teams and assume that they'll just get it done. You really need someone from the business that can own that as well. And ideally, you have IT that's part of that project team that's led by the business, certainly either at the project delivery level, or sometimes we'll see situations where the executive sponsor is from the business side. So you might have someone like a CFO or a COO that's the executive sponsor. Then you've got the project team below that includes IT, but it also includes a lot of people from the business. So a few different ways you can tackle that, but I think in general, there are some CIOs I've worked with that are very business savvy and they actually came from operations or they know the business inside and out. They're not super technical, so they can see the bigger picture. Those types of IT leaders I think are okay, or that's a perfectly fine owner of the project, but most organizations don't have that type of person. Most people have a CIO that kind of grew up in the traditional IT world. They know technology very well. They know how to support the organization from an IT perspective. They're going to be a key stakeholder in the transformation, but they're not always necessarily the one that should be owning the project or the one leading it. Oftentimes they'll defer to the business. So that's an interesting point there from Mark. We also have George Deramouskas. It's a Greek last name. I can tell it's Greek, but I just can't pronounce the name. It's George Deramouskas, I think is how you pronounce it. And he said, no, they should not be led by IT. The IT department should be in direct contact with the appropriate stakeholder in each department, and there should be a reasonable back and forth when it comes to discussing specifications and implementations. So that's an interesting point. He also goes on to say that the internal groups involved should be aware to a reasonable degree of the capabilities of the ERP system so that when they come up with the final specifications, there will be minor objections from the IT team. While leadership in theory is top-down, course adjustments must and will be done based on the feedback from IT. So very similar comment or viewpoint as Mark had, which is IT is critical, IT needs to be heavily involved, but it shouldn't be IT leading it. It should be top-down, more from a business perspective, having the business owner that's ultimately overseeing and responsible for the transformation or the ERP project. Now, another comment here, this one's from Richard Lewine, or Lewine. It's Richard Lewine, I believe it is. And he says, it's always about the people, not electronics. So I would suspect that means, I don't know what that means. It might mean that it's not an IT-driven sort of thing, but it could also mean that it could be IT-driven as long as we're focused on the people. And I would agree with that. If you're focused on people and you've got a very strong business involvement, that's sort of the bare minimum you need to be successful in these sorts of initiatives and projects. Another comment here is from Eduardo Muniz, and he's someone I've been connected with and interacted quite a bit with on social media over the years. And his comment is, IT people can't do something they don't know. Change and transformation has never been their cup of tea. Track record confirms that most IT platforms have been traditionally wrongly deployed and unsustainable because of lack of organizational readiness and lack of change governance. So, and then he poses a question of what can they do differently that have not been done so far to help companies deploy IT platforms rightly or correctly. So it's a good point. You need people that know what they're doing and that have been maybe not been through this exact sort of transformation before, but someone who knows how to manage and lead a project, knows what the business needs are, and knows how to translate those business needs into what the future state of the organization could be from a people, process, and technology perspective. And that's why I think a lot of times it's the operational focused people that have a better sense of that, because they're the ones that are largely driving the direction of the organization as a whole, and then IT is really meant to be an enabler of that and providing the tools and the capabilities to get you there from a operational perspective. So I think it's a very similar comment or a similar thread there that should be that IT should be an enabler rather than a leader of a transformation. And then finally, last but not least, Fadakimi Sadiq provided a comment that said other departments should lead the initiative while IT comes as support to guide the digital transformation process. couldn't agree more. So there's a lot of good comments there, but I think this set of responses from the audience was actually a bit more aligned than the Agile Waterfall discussion that we had at the beginning of the segment. The Agile Waterfall discussion, there's a lot of mixed comments or opinions on that, whereas I think here most are agreeing that the business or the operations should be the ones leading your transformation. And what I would say too is you also, even though I make this generalization, and many that have responded to this question made the same generalization, that IT should be an enabler and the business should be driving it and the operation should be driving it rather than the IT. Even though most of us are saying that, I think you also have to look at the people you have. I mean, if you're an organization that has a really strong business savvy IT leader, that might be perfectly fine to have that person own it, have the IT department own it in that case. The risk there, though, you want to be careful of is just making sure that you don't treat it as an IT initiative and you don't expect that IT person to have all the answers without involving people heavily from the business and other stakeholders. So that's the only risk there. But it could be done if you have that purple unicorn, I think is the comment that one of the people made in the thread here. So if you have that purple unicorn, that person that's that strong, which I have seen a handful of those in my career with various clients, then that can be perfectly fine. And you also have to look at too, what other resources do you have? What business stakeholders are going to be involved? How are you going to have HR involved from a change management or organizational design perspective? How are we going to involve external people, whether it's consultants, system integrator, technical resources, data migration resources, all that stuff? How are you going to put this whole team together? And you can't really answer one of these questions without answering the whole equation and putting together the entire puzzle. So that's the other caveat I'd say, is just make sure you have a vision of what you want the overall project and staff to look like, and put together the right team accordingly. So thank you for everyone who responded on that. And again, if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, be sure to do so. That's where I have a lot of this discussion, asking questions and responding to questions and comments out on LinkedIn. So I encourage you to follow me there if you're not already, and appreciate everyone who provided feedback here today.